Hey, it's Soul, and welcome to my beginner's guide to soloing delves. You'll learn the fundamentals to help you clear delves safely, no matter your class or role, and as you gear up, eventually, maybe you'll take on greater challenges. Specifically, we're going to cover how to effectively navigate combat and get you to rethink how you've been looking at outdoor combat over the past few years. Since this is my first guide for delves, I'm going to take it a little bit slow with the intro, so bear with me and or use the navigation to get where you want to go. I hope this turns out to be useful to you, so if it does, please hit the like button to support more videos like these, subscribe for more WoW coverage, and catch me live wherever I'm streaming to. Let's first refresh our expectations. Delves are a new feature in WoW's latest expansion, The War Within, targeted primarily towards what Blizzard has called an underserved audience, folks who stick to outdoor world content and tend to not get caught up with the hustle and bustle of organized raids and mythic keystone dungeons and raided PvP. Delves are the capstone to outdoor content progression. It's the answer to those who wanted the world to feel more dangerous and give reasons to be excited to get stronger gear to let you complete activities that might have felt more like chores than an adventure or a challenge. Because of that, Delves introduced gameplay that might feel alien if you're not familiar with gameplay from Vanilla WoW, aka WoW Classic, where you've got to be a little bit more careful with how you enter combat. Initiating the pull is sometimes a puzzle to be solved. You'll be challenged to use your whole class toolkit in order to succeed at higher levels, and I'm here to help you along. While this is a basic guide, it'll assume you've done at least a few delves and understand the structure of progression as well as how your companion works. The goal of this guide is to increase your confidence in delves after being armed with knowledge, because delves take a different approach from solo content in the outdoor world. I'm going to cover gameplay tactics that might seem remedial, but they are a foundation to later success. And also, I want to reassure you that it's totally okay if you're struggling with delves and the pressures of social media are not helping. World of Warcraft is an old game with, admittedly, an old player base, some of us with pretty warped ideas of what challenge is supposed to mean, and I struggle with it myself. Delves are unique in that they can be something that you group for, you knock out, you get some gear, and you go home. But delves can also be your arena, your personal space for progression, just you and the challenge set before you and Brann or whatever NPC is with you when you're watching this guide. Let's start with a look at talents, and we're not going to get very class specific, but just talents at a high level and how they can influence your game. Many but not all of the more useful abilities for delves will be found on the class talent tree on the left here. What you're looking for are abilities or talents that help you control your combat situation. So stuns, slows, movement speed buffs, and self-healing, those are powerful tools when slamming your attack buttons isn't quite enough. Take a good long look at them and take note of what these abilities can do. Not all of them are going to be useful in every situation, but the time may come when you encounter a tough pull and you're like, oh yeah, hey, let's try this ability and see what happens. Because remember, this is a game, folks. Just like you're exploring the world of Warcraft and all its delights, explore what your character, your class, is also capable of. In the future, I'll try to create individual class guides for delves, although really, let me know in the comments if this is something you want to see. Delves are best compared to the old days of WoW, where a fight can quickly get out of control and survival isn't guaranteed if you do an improper pull. It's still true now, but to a lesser degree thanks to a very robust class toolkit of utilities and cooldowns. And today it's not so unusual to grab a whole pack of mobs and mow them down, and those extra buttons may go unused. Delves can be the challenge you want them to be, but they're also a personal space. There's no punishment for failing or experimenting. When soloing, there's no one to pressure you or make you feel embarrassed for making a mistake. As a solo experience, you almost always have first strike advantage in delves, as in you can choose how to start your encounter. Pulling might just take the push of a button, but it's also half the battle. So one very important tip, it doesn't work every time, but in many cases, you're able to pull a single mob out of a pack with a ranged ability when you might be used to the entire pack pulling entering combat. Again, it doesn't work with every pull, but you can watch, observe, and grab a stray mob out of a group, enabling you to bypass the management of handling multiple enemies. Sometimes you might surprise yourself grabbing an enemy in the middle of a pack and no one else comes with them. Make sure you use simple, long-range abilities that don't end up exploding and, again, only affect one enemy. Many enemies inside delves can be exceptionally tough, but when they're alone, they follow patterns of throwing melee attacks, followed by casts that can be dealt with, or area attacks that can be avoided. Taking on 2 or more of these mobs is both super dangerous and a choice that you don't have to make. You can employ use of crowd control abilities before the pull too, and I'll get to that in just a bit. Line of sight is a term used to lure in enemies, especially ones that are capable of their own ranged attacks. What you do is tap the mob to enter combat, run around a corner, and line of sight. Watch as the fool marches off to their doom. It's an old tactic, but highly effective at isolating enemies, notably spellcasters with powerful nukes that can bring you down even with lots of gear. Especially early on, you want to take every opportunity to isolate enemies due to their abilities or because they might run away, and then you and your companion can beat them down in safety. This also works great if you want to take on packs of easier mobs that might have a mix of melee and ranged enemies or are a little bit spread apart. Tap them all, go around the corner, and then get ready to go nuts. Line of sight doesn't have to be used for just the pull either. Clever use of cornering lets you avoid spellcasting entirely, though obviously at the cost of you dealing damage. Your companion will be able to fire away at them, but between spellcasts will be when you try to deal your own damage while, at the same time, keep the mobs threat on you for them to run over. Kiting is an important skill to develop where you keep the enemy chasing you but never let an attack actually go off. This is a great practice for classes with very long cooldowns between stuns and silence abilities, buying them time for these cooldowns to refresh. Sometimes line of sight doesn't help so much because the space is so wide open. In that case, run really far away, as in kite, and employ slows if you have them to increase the distance between you and the enemy. You're not being a coward, you're just repositioning to bring the odds in your favor. But you can range casts too, as in you run really far away, forcing the enemy to move closer to you regardless. The risk might be higher, but at least you have the enemy isolated. As said, not every delve offers the luxury of line of sight, so let's talk about crowd control, which plays a part before and during combat. Since we were just talking about pulling mobs, effective crowd control plays a part when multiple mobs are in fact linked together, or when the fight just becomes a mess and you're determined to not run away, at least not yet. Which packs pull together isn't consistent. You're going to learn them on your own as you run more delves, but part of the fun or the surprise or frustration is exploring the possibilities for yourself. Crowd control tools vary depending on your class, sometimes your specialization. You want to look at your class talent tree on the left-hand side to identify these, and some are just baked right into the class regardless of talents. Mages have the very iconic polymorph spell, which works on most enemies in delves. Meanwhile, paladins can keep targets out of the fight with repentance as a talent selection, and hunters can use freezing traps directly on enemies. This makes pulls much safer. You can still use these abilities in the middle of combat, but it's a lot more hectic. Especially because you have an NPC like Brann you can't easily coordinate with, and they might break your crowd control. Being able to lock enemies down mid-fight feels good though, and ideally you'll want to use it on ranged enemies who are standing still and are easier to target. Most classes have a mix of crowd control, with abilities that can take an enemy out of the fight, or at least temporarily so you can defeat higher priority targets. Slows, stuns, and knockbacks keep melee fighters away from you. Kicks and knockbacks can stop a caster's momentum as well. The likes of warlocks may have a less effective interrupt compared to other classes, but they can cast a well-timed fear to interrupt a cast and otherwise buy some time while the enemy is running around crazy. It's a high-risk maneuver that doesn't always pay off, but hey, it's worth a shot. As you gain proficiency, you'll learn which mobs cast, what, and how often, and unconsciously you'll identify patterns and mob abilities as well as yours. You'll eventually have go-to abilities, and you'll find yourself able to control the battlefield with relative ease. But of course, if the pull goes horribly wrong, in most cases you can just run away really far, just like in outdoor combat. A good pull means you get to choose the encounter conditions, and it's extremely important to know your terrain. I'll do a brief slideshow of the different delves and point out areas you can use distance and line of sight to your advantage. I'm not going to go through all of them, but remembering these will help set you up for anything Blizzard throws at you in the future. Down in Earthcrawl Mines, the large room uses these massive pillars you can use to line of sight enemies. Sometimes this room is used to encounter waves of enemies where you have much less control, but you can also run out of the room or into a corner when the encounter begins. From there you can wait for mobs to approach or tap mobs and retreat back to your little safe spot and repeat the process. The elevation when climbing up can also be used to line of sight or outrange abilities, and further ahead you can use the support on the side to line of sight and single pull enemies. Fungal Folly doesn't offer the same kinds of line of sight opportunities, but there's still room to pull mobs away from their packs. You can also try some high-risk maneuvering. There are some explosive spore enemies you can use to your advantage. When you move close enough, they become aggressive and they chase you, but they also constantly lose HP. Upon death, they shake for a bit and then explode, knocking back and dealing very high damage to anyone in range, enemies and you, and then they respawn after about 20 or 30 seconds. Cheesy tanks can drag mobs together into these explosions and use their abilities to survive the blast. With practice though, one can just kite mobs into range while they safely stand outside of the circle to explode the mobs and cut down the encounter time considerably. Again, it's high risk, but it's a lot of fun to do once you're used to it. Kriegval's Rest has plenty of straight lines and corners with the occasional pillar to help control combat. You'll also be managing a candle that sort of restricts your movement. Standing outside of it will reduce your maximum HP and it gets smaller as you move. But you can also press a button here to put the candle down in a strategic place to prevent it from losing its effectiveness, and then pull mobs to you, as in line of sight, and fight in the candle's radius freely. Sometimes in the final room, you'll encounter an ambush. You can sort of negate the ambush by just leaving the room and going around the corner to engage the enemy packs. The Waterwork Delve works very similarly, where you lay down the totem before combat to maximize your space and movement, preferably around a corner so you can isolate enemies. The Dread Pits is a remarkably open delve with very few, if any, places to line of sight, but lots of room to pull mobs away from packs or to run away with minimal risk of running into other enemies. Taquarthon Abyss and the Sinkhole feel restrictive because of the breath meter. But it also simplifies the gameplay. All you have to do is just fight in your air bubbles and utilize what little line of sight or distance opportunities there are. You can also use potions of underwater breathing and noggin fogger elixirs to negate the breath timer. These are just an auction house trip away. And we can't forget Brann, who's your companion during Season 1 of The War Within. He's a bit of a wild card, but you can configure him to smooth your incoming damage in exchange for some of his firepower. As you run delves, you'll collect different curios, and I'll highlight some useful ones for beginners. The curios you get are randomly chosen at the end of bountiful delves, so if you still haven't found the one you want, just keep at it. Under combat curios, the Unbreakable Icon is arguably the most offensive. If you're in trouble, Brann will taunt enemies toward them, taking a bit of heat off your back. The Idol of the Earth Mother is also very useful when in trouble, as it gives a shield depending on missing health. This is great against enemies who inflict damage over time debuffs on you. Meanwhile, the Light-Touched Idol is ideal for those with very little self-healing, for example mages, who can pop their mirror images to proc this for an additional heal. Under Utility Curios, my favorites are either the Amorphous Relic for additional damage and health, or at least sometimes, or the Relic of Sentience, which lays down more steel traps or healing potions depending on how I spec Brann. I find that when progressing into delves, keeping Brann as a healer will give me the most consistent results, but when I feel more comfortable, I'll switch him to damage dealing. Isolated enemies are naturally much easier to take down. With predictable attack patterns, you can handle fairly easily even as a caster or a cloth user. Slow and steady pulls are better than running back after a death, and with delves, it's entirely in your control when you want to step it up and go for faster, riskier pulls after getting yourself some gear, upgrades from Brann, and most importantly, practice. That's the guide, and I hope this helps you get into the mindset of solo adventuring in delves. If you want more beginner's tips on specific classes or boss encounters, let me know in the comments. Please like this video if it was useful, share it with others, subscribe for more WoW coverage, and catch me live wherever I'm streaming. Thanks for coming. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay breezy.